Hello, students. I hope you're doing well, at least better than I'm doing. I decided not to do a sort of a face cam for this thing because I've not feeling my best, not looking my best. So I'll try to get us through this as quickly as possible today. I think that this is not going to be as long as the last one. I'm aiming for around a half hour for this entire lecture. So we'll speed through this a little bit, but this is an important lecture because this is going to really lead into a lot of the other things that we're going to be talking about at the end of our course, particularly the ideas of nationalism that are going to lead to World War II, and also the growth of communism, actually going to strangely come out of some of these French idealistic ideals. So we'll see how that happens today. Here's the music I was going to play for today. You can listen to this. This is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Basically, it was dedicated to Napoleon. You can actually see where he scratched this off. He actually viewed Napoleon as this wonderful savior of the French people. But something happens and he completely changes his mind. And we'll discuss that towards the end of our lecture today. So, our main goals and questions are pretty straightforward. The first question is, what specific events and situations lead to the French Revolution? So what I'm looking for here is not just short-term what happens immediately that causes the French people to revolt, but rather the long-term factors as well, and we'll talk about those shortly. And then the second question is basically what happens? What happens? Why is it important? And what are the long-term effects of this? Not only for France, but for all of Europe and eventually the entire world. So we'll get there towards the second half of this lecture. So France doesn't start in a revolutionary state. All revolutions start from something typically more benign, and there's usually a lot of different reasons for revolution, and France has quite a few of them. So we're going to go through those now. Perhaps one of the biggest reasons for their revolution is similar to the problem that China has always had, and this is that problem of prosperity that I had talked about with China so frequently in the past. And the problem in China was that they'd been so successful that there was no justification for changing their old ways. Well, in France they had something similar, and it was called the Ancient Regime, and it's basically the Ancient Regime basically talks about the collected cultural heritage of French history. So ever since the fall of the Roman Empire in the 300s, 400s AD until the 1800s when the French Revolution starts, France has developed this culture, this sort of ideology, this way of living, this sort of built up aristocratic traditions and these ways of behaving that for a long time had made them very successful. But the problem is that this ancient regime put nobles in power. It gave them a lot of power, and over the centuries they consolidated a lot of that power. And the state was so successful for so long that no one ever wanted to challenge it. But as we're going to see, that power of the ancient regime is going to eventually start to fall, and when it starts to fall, it's going to lead to a big vacuum that needs to be filled in France. And we'll see that as we go forward. This is going to be one of the causes of the French Revolution, and we'll see that down here. So the guy who's on the throne when the French Revolution happens is this guy, King Louis XVI. And he's distantly related to King Louis XIV, the Sun King that we mentioned very briefly earlier on in our class. You won't need to remember him. But Louis is actually a typical monarch. And I say he's typical because he is very similar to many of the other rulers of his day. He's very similar to the rulers of Great Britain. He's similar, like King George, he's similar to the Habsburg in Austria. He's similar to his half-brother Charles on the throne in Spain. And with the things that he's interested in, he's got this idea of divine right of kings. And we talked about this earlier, but it's basically the idea that God gives kings the right to rule. So when Louis runs into economic problems or political problems, he doesn't really want to talk it out. And that's not unusual. And that's one of the things that's important to remember. It's not unusual for kings at this point in time to not want to talk things out, to not want to discuss things in a sort of, egalitarian modern sense. But his refusal to work with the lower classes and middle classes, because again, he sees himself as a divine king based on this ancient regime, his refusal to work with the lower classes is going to help lead to the revolution as well. Perhaps the biggest underlying long-term causes of the French Revolution is this third point. They France has been in horrendous debt for the last 3 or 4 decades when the French Revolution is starting to brew. And this really starts with the Hundred Years' War, which is a long time ago, but it really picks up in the French and Indian War, or also known as the Seven Years' War. We did talk about this one up in particular, and it's really important because France loses, if you recall, they lose most of their territory in Canada, they lose most of their other colonies, they lose India, and they have to pay war reparations back to Great Britain. So they get into a huge, huge hole. Just as they're getting about ready to pay all that off, the Americans ask for help in the American Revolution. Well, the Americans actually win the American Revolution, but it still puts France in a huge bind. So France is in huge amounts of debts. And another problem is there's been lots of famines going on through France. Their traditional bread baskets have not been able to produce as much grain and food as normal. And what that's caused is it's caused increasingly rising food prices. Couple these two together, that means that your economy is in shambles and all of a sudden people can't get fed. This part is really important. People always forget about the food thing. They're always interested in the sexier stuff like debts from wars and kings and queens. But in reality, the thing that most leads to the French Revolution is lack of food. People can put up with a lot, but they don't put up with being hungry. Another thing that leads to the French Revolution is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is this idea that we've got this rational, ordered society, and people start to look at it and say, well, the king doesn't make sense in this Enlightenment sense. These sort of new ideas of self-government and voting and rights and liberty, well, it doesn't fit with this what's called an absolute monarch, and we'll see that in a second. And but yeah, it's basically this. It's the idea that people are angry that you've got this absolute monarch who's on the throne who says that basically I'm the king and I get to call all the shots. And people are like, well, we have these huge debts, we have all these food problems, and who else is to blame but you? And that's essentially what happens. And so France starts to broil up into all of these problems. There's some revolts in the street about food. And Louis is like, okay, all right, I'm basically going to call it a large meeting, and we're going to solve this problem, and then everybody's going to be happy. There's not going to be any issues anymore. We'll solve it fairly, and we'll solve it with Enlightenment ideals. This is what Louis is telling everybody. But as we're going to see, it's not actually a very fair vote at all. Now, the French have this thing called the Estates General. And the Estates General is basically the meeting of these three different estates. This is supposed to represent everyone in France. You can kind of think of this as a Congress or a parliament. But different from how modern parliaments and congresses work, they don't meet all the time. This Congress meets really only when it's convened. So Louis convenes it as sort of an emergency measure because everybody's starving and the economy's in shambles. And so they meet and basically are like, we're going to vote on what to do. Basically what he wants to do is he wants to propose more taxes, and as you can imagine, for most people raising taxes is not very popular. But Louis says, well, we're going to do it, we're going to vote, we're going to make sure that everything's good to go, and so we're going to make sure everything's fair. But the way the voting works, and this is important, the way the voting works is each one of the estates gets one vote. And the reason for this is to avoid ties. So if you've got three estates voting, then that means that there's never going to be a tie. The problem is, look how the estates are divided up. The first two estates are essentially the upper class. This is the clergy, this is the Catholic Church, these are the people who own land in France. The nobles are part of the ancient regime. But notice this is less than 500,000 people. You can think of this as the one percenters. And then the third estate is everybody else. 24 million people are part of this group. And so they convene this meeting and they say, well, let's vote on proposing more taxes. Well, what do you think is going to happen? These two groups are going to work together because these two groups have a vested interest in making sure that their money keeps coming in, that they keep their power consolidated. So they're always going to vote against the third estate. But these people, this group of people, they're hungry, their debts are starting to pile up, they're losing their livelihoods, they get really angry. And so they take it onto themselves to find a solution to the problems from France. And what they do is they hold the National Assembly. Now, this is basically a meeting, a second meeting of the Estates General. But the king doesn't call this one. So the king called the first Estates General meeting, basically calling Parliament. But this one is different. The third estate, the peasants, the lowest classes, basically says, screw it. We're going to have a meeting and we're going to decide what to do with France on our own terms. And they invite the other classes. They invite the other estates. They say, well, you're welcome to come if you want, but if you're not there, we're just going to keep doing our own thing. Now, when they try to do this, they try to schedule it at the Palace of Versailles, which is basically in the capital of Paris, and this is supposed to be the center of power. Well, Louis hears that they're trying to schedule this meeting, and Louis is like, "Oh, I'd love to let you have your meeting, but there's a problem. We can't let you do that because they're actually cleaning the windows that day, so you can't hold it that day." And then they're like, okay, well, what if we do it this day? It's like, oh, well, we're having a banquet that day. You can't do it that day. The point is that Louis recognizes, even before this meeting happens, that if this meeting takes place, it's going to start mob rule. It's sort of a mass panic among the people. And he's absolutely right. So the National Assembly, this third estate, sort of see what Louis is trying to do, try to blackmail them, trying to get them out of there, and not try to vote on these issues in France. And they say, screw it, we're going to hold it wherever we can actually get room. And this actually leads to what's called the tennis court oath. You can actually see a picture here. And what's going on is the people of the National Assembly is like, well, if you won't give us a room, we'll just do it in the tennis courts. And that's exactly what they do. And it's supposed to represent sort of how disgruntled and how disgraced the third estate, the peasants, are, because they can't even get a room to discuss their issues. So where do they come up with their meeting? Well, what they come up with, one of the things is this thing called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. This is really important because it's going to be modeled on the American Constitution. And we're going to see that in our next slide. But they come up with these ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So this idea of liberty is a really big idea, an Enlightenment idea. Equality is a really big thing. But fraternity is perhaps the biggest one here. And this is basically the idea that men are supposed to work together. They're supposed to work together in government, they're supposed to work together in their private lives, and it's supposed to lead to a better functioning society. Importantly, a king doesn't fit very well into these ideas because a king's sort of seen as a block to liberty because you can't do what you want, and it's sort of a block to equality because how can it be equal if the king is on top of everybody? And what ends up happening is they're like, well, we need to get rid of these estates, these different estates. These divide us. So this is the end of the first estate because they start something totally new. And what's going to happen is these ideas that they have are going to spread throughout France. And at first, Louis is like, well, I'm not really worried about this. And, he's not wrong about this at first because when he's looking at what's going on in France, he's looking at a history of over 1,000 years of strong kingdom rule. And so at first he's like, well, these people are just having their own little meeting and it's not going to really amount to anything. Well, it starts to pick up more power on the street. People start to take up rebellions and so they start to do demonstrations and protest on the street. And at first Louis is trying to work with them, but he soon realizes that it's going to be incompatible with him retaining all of his power. So what he does is he fires one of the most prominent members of the assembly, so this lower class. This sort of supposed to be a liaison or a representative to the state, and his name was Necker. And Louis is like, you're a symbol of all this, you're causing all this trouble, Necker, we're going to fire you. Well, the problem is Necker was incredibly popular with the population, and they see this as a sign that the government has turned tyrannical. Basically, Louis has become a tyrant, and that he's going to do whatever he wants whenever he wants to do it. Well, the assembly meets again, and they meet again in Paris, and they meet in the streets, and they're trying to have these big debates in public about the excesses of the king. But this isn't very good for Louis. And you have to understand Louis's point of view here. It seems like an open rebellion. He's trying to restore order in his country. So what he does is he hires mercenaries to come and stop the assembly from meeting. Well, the assembly don't like it very much because they feel like they're being actually attacked by their own government. And again, neither side is necessarily wrong here because they are being attacked by their government, but from Louis's point of view, these people are rebellious. So what happens is these people start to rebel and they actually push against some of these mercenaries because it's thousands of people. And in Paris, they start to riot, and the place that they choose to sort of make a stand is that this place called the Bastille. The Bastille is actually this castle that you see here, and it was supposed to be a prison. And it was supposed to be a place where political prisoners were kept, because it's not useful as a castle anymore, because the age of castles has long passed. But it's not really the fact that it's a political prison that they're invading this place, because there were maybe only 6 or 7 political prisoners in the Bastille at this time. Far more important, and the reason that the French Republic, or excuse me, the French people storm the Bastille and take it over, is because it's a symbol of the ancient regime. And it's a symbol of all of France's heritage and all of the good and the awful stuff that comes with it. And it's supposed to represent the nobility, it's supposed to represent the corruption of the state. And so they take it over. And that's the reason that they do it, and they're able to do it because there's so many of them. And what happens is this sort of creates a new period. This is going to start the French Revolution. It's called the storming of the Bastille. They still celebrate Bastille Day in France for this very reason. But what happens is really interesting. Many nobles flee outside of France. Now think about this. This is important because if you're a noble and these peasants are on these ideas of fraternity and equality and liberty and getting rid of the upper classes, and they just stormed a freaking castle and now have access to guns and ammunitions and all that kind of stuff, well, you're probably a pretty safe bet to be a good target for this mob. And so what do these people do? Well, they start to flee outside of France. And these people, these nobles, are going to be very important to our story. And I'll let you know when that comes back into play. So this Declaration of the Rights of Man after the July 14th storming of the Bastille comes back into play big time. And like I say here, it's passed by the National Assembly, but it's inspired by the American Revolution. And the idea here is that this is built on the success of the Americans. They say, well, the Americans kicked off a tyrannical king. Why don't we do the same thing? Importantly, this is a secular natural law. This is not, there are references to God in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, but it's very brief and it's towards the end. It's not God-given rights. These are, men are free because that's the way it is. It's a secular law, and that's going to be really important because who is this really going to tick off? The first estate, the church, the highest of the highest, the one who own most of the land in France, are going to get really upset at this idea that, well, God doesn't get to choose who gets the land, and God doesn't allow people to tax and do all of these things. And we're going to see that's going to become a big problem. So one of the first parts of the preamble is this idea that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Well, this is going to be really important because we've already mentioned this, because in Saint-Domingue, where the Haitians are going to revolt, they're going to use the French Revolution as an example of why they're doing what they're doing. And we're going to see that towards the end of this lecture. Importantly, notice this does not apply to women. So you can say that this is equality and egalitarianism and those wonderful things. Women aren't included here. It's talking about men first and foremost. Not going to be until later, actually, feminists in France write the Declaration of the Rights of Women later on in the 1800s. But for the early part, only concerned about men, and it's mostly concerned about Frenchmen. But we'll talk about that later. So here's a timeline of the French Revolution. So the absolute monarchy was what we talked about with Louis. Louis is basically the idea that I'm divinely inspired by kings. I don't need to have checks and balances. That's been going on for centuries. Well, after the Bastille is storming, they don't all of a sudden go to something completely radical and completely something different. Really what they're doing is they're trying to get their demands met. And those demands are lower taxes, they're trying to get food put into place, sort of a check on the government, check on the king. And so Louis agrees, he capitulates, and he says, yeah, I'll work with you guys. And that starts what's known as the constitutional monarchy. That's when they write the Constitution, a French Constitution, guaranteeing rights of people and checking the power of the king. Well, what's going to happen is Louis isn't terribly happy with this. He's going to try to run away, and they're going to kill him. And we're going to see that in our next slide. But once Louis is dead, the French people are going to start what's known as the Republic. This is the very liberal excuse me, the liberal phase. This is when things are really kicking off. This is when things are very radical compared to what they used to be. It's also known as the convention. And this is going to be a very bloody period, as we're going to see in a few slides. Well, the republic doesn't last, and the republic's going to then be replaced by what's called as the directory. This is ruled by a few people, not by a republic, not by lots of voting. It sort of is going against it's sort of going against the excesses of this period. So you can kind of think it as absolute monarchy. You've got tyranny here, and then they try to check it. Well, the king doesn't like it, and then he leaves, and so they go really, really liberal, and then they go really, really conservative as a response. But that really conservative response is going to be a big problem, and that's going to lead to Napoleon. So this is sort of a timeline. You don't need to remember all of that, just kind of give you an idea of where we're going. This is a map of Europe that we're going to return to, but I wanted you to notice some of the big players here. Great Britain is completely formed. They're going to be a big important part of our story. Spain is unified, Portugal is unified. The Austrian monarchy is perhaps one of the biggest powers in Europe at this point. The Austrians and the Prussians, which are going to later become the Germans, are incredibly powerful, as well as the Russians. But what's going to happen is going to be very interesting. Those players are actually going to be involved in the French Revolution. It's not a revolution simply isolated. This is not happening within a bubble. And this is really going to play with the start of the Republic period, that third period after the constitutional monarchy is over. So here's how this works. King Louis says to the people, yeah, I'll give you all of these rights that you want. We're going to let you have a little bit more freedom. We're going to let you have a little bit more, ability to vote and be invested in your government. But secretly, he knew that the moment he starts giving up concessions, he's eventually going to get deposed later on. And so he actually plans on fleeing. He actually plans, he and his wife, Marie Antoinette, and all of his children, they basically disguise themselves as travelers and try to leave France. Well, where do you think he's going? He's actually going to Austria. Now, the reason he's going to Austria is because Austria themselves have a king on the throne. They have an absolute monarch on the throne, and they realize that if France gets rid of their monarch, then who's to stop that revolutionary idea from coming to Austria? And the Spanish also want to keep this in check. The Prussians also want to keep this in check. And so Louis is working with the nobles who have fled France. And this is important. Remember how a few slides ago I said after the Bastille, a lot of nobles fled France? Well, many of them go to Austria, and Louis tries to join them. Well, there's a big problem because Louis gets caught. And so they get caught right on the border between France and Austria, and they take him back to the capital, and people are like, whoa, why are you trying to leave, Louis? Because this is new to all of them. They're like, I thought we were cool on all of this. I thought we were doing all of these things. And then to top it all off, once they've captured Louis, the Austrians, the Spaniards, the Prussians all tell the French revolutionists that they can't do anything to Louis. They have to let him go, they have to release him from prison, and if they don't, they'll attack them. Well, the French people see this, so the combination that they think that Louis is working with the enemies of France, so basically Austria and Spain. He says that because they're going to attack us, that means that you're working with them. That must mean that you've cut some sort of backroom deal. And so what happens is the National Assembly convenes and they vote. And they basically say, we're going to kill you. We're going to kill you for conspiracy against the Republic, against the liberty of the people. And they execute him. They execute him, and then later on they're going to execute his wife, Marie Antoinette. And what happens after this is actually quite radical. And what I've got to say here is basically, once the king is dead, now you've completely gotten rid of the monarchy. Now there's no king, now there's no sort of succession of the throne, there's no constitutional monarchy. They create a republic. And the idea of the republic is that the people should vote. The people should elect who's going to be in charge. The people should elect who's going to be able to call the shots. And what's going to happen is they're going to form their own republic, but most monarchies in Europe are outraged because they themselves are monarch, and they just saw Louis get his head chopped off. You can see his head right there. So if you're a monarch in Austria, you're a monarch in Spain, or you're a monarch in Prussia, you're going to be pretty concerned with what's going on in France. And we're going to return to them, But we need to talk about what goes on in France during the Republican period. Well, a guy by the name of Maximilien Robespierre takes power during the Republic. And Robespierre is actually a pretty ruthless guy. He's known as saying terror is nothing more than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. So basically, his idea is that it's not really terrorism to execute people in public, but rather justice. And Maximilien Robespierre is going to usher in this era called the Terror. This is the years between 1793 and 1794. This is in the Republic period. So I know this is confusing, but you'll have to just bear with me there with all the different types of the French Revolution. But Robespierre gets into power, and this is the new very liberal phase. And what they're looking for is what they're looking for many times in revolutions, and that's what they're called counter-revolutionaries, or what the French call them, people who do crimes against liberty. These are parts of the old tradition. These are the people of the first estates, the clergy. These are people of the second estates, the noblemen. These are people who want to put in a constitutional monarchy. These are people who want to say, well, maybe we're not going to be quite so radical. Maybe we'll keep our republic, but we won't do these land reform ideas that you've got going on, Maximilian. And so he says, well, no, you guys are enemies of the revolution. You're going to ruin our revolution. You're going to make us worse than when we started. So what he does is he rounds up people, and over the course of these 2 years, ends up executing between 15 and 40,000 people individually. And interestingly enough, the method that they use is the guillotine. Now, this is actually a real picture. I love this picture for that reason, because it gives you a sense of what this would have looked like. You have the guillotine in the middle, and then the whole town comes in the middle. This actually is one of the last public guillotines in history. But everybody would gather around, and so it makes a big statement. But one of the things that is really remarkable about Maximilien Robespierre is that he executes a lot of people. And so he really alienates a lot of people in the government. They're like, this guy is too tyrannical. Is this any better than a king? And so here's a political cartoon from Maximilien. So you can see Robespierre right here. And, he's sort of standing on the Declaration of Rights of Man. He doesn't care. And he's got a guillotine, but this is actually supposed to be a puppet. And the reason this is supposed to be a puppet is because this is a funeral pyre, and it basically says the tomb of all of France. So basically the idea is that, look, he's already executed all of France. He doesn't have anybody else. But he's crazy. He's this madman. He's just executing whatever he can. So the Republic was sort of broken from the start because of Robespierre. And so when Robespierre comes to power, people really start to say, well, maybe this Republic idea doesn't work at all. Maybe this is just a bad form of government. Maybe this government leads to these excesses. And what ends up happening is there's a coup. And what happens, and you can see here, this is another guillotining, but the guy they're guillotining is Robespierre. And you can see everybody is happy. They're dancing in the streets. Everybody's happy about what's going on. And what happens is they have another sort of counter-revolution. So they go from super liberal and having these land reform ideas and super, super, super fast revolution and super fast Republican ideology. And Robespierre screws it all up. And so what happens is a new government comes in after Robespierre is dead and replaces the Republic. And that government is called the Directory, and they're actually considered to be far more conservative. Now, the Directory is not a king. It's actually a rule by sort of 5 people. But the problem with this is these people are trying to eliminate things like voting. These people are trying to eliminate things like rights. So the idea that people have rights to government or rights to property and rights to privacy. So they want to sort of take people's private lands. And they also, importantly, they also basically make it so that food is more expensive. And the reason they do this is because they're working with the people who are producing the food. So they're like, all right, we're going to make the food more expensive so you make more money. Throughout this whole period, since the fall of Louis, the food problem in France has never been solved. And that makes it much easier for people to revolt and rebel. Because when you don't have food, it's really hard to justify just sitting around and taking the status quo. So what does the conservative Directory do? Well, like I mentioned, they sort of take power, they reverse the Republic, there's a few people, and they basically make it so that the government gets to call the shots again. Well, one of the things they do is they're actually starting to fight in a lot of foreign wars. And one of the reasons they're doing this is because France is beginning to be attacked. Because while all this is going on, the nobles that had fled France initially after the storming of the Bastille want to kick all this nonsense out. They want to kick all these people back out of France. They want to restore the power of a monarch to the throne of France. And what ends up happening is countries like Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Austria, Spain, they all start to attack France. Well, the Directory starts to take an offensive role, and they start to fight foreign wars in Belgium, in the Netherlands. And what's really important about this is this sort of temporarily puts a band-aid on France's economic problems, because France again has never solved that financial issue that they had after the Seven Years' War, even at the late 1700s. Excuse me. And so what happens is they start to win some battles in the Netherlands and Belgium, basically sort of a trick attack. They didn't know that they were going to attack there. And so they get all these spoils of war and they bring them all back to France. And so for a little while, everybody's pretty happy. But a big, big problem is Great Britain has now joined into the fighting. So Great Britain is starting to take over some of the shipping lines of France. They're basically naval stuff, and we're going to get to that. But what happens is the Directory, even though they're winning these wars and they're getting in some extra cash, by the 1799s they don't have any extra battles they can easily win. And when they do win battles, it's on French-controlled territory, so there's not new conquests to get. And so what happens is the Directory gets almost broke by the 1799. So one of the main factors that started the French Revolution is still a problem many years into it. And that's going to lead to this guy, Napoleon. And he actually wasn't as short as you might have sometimes heard. The only reason we think he's short is because modern scholars looked at his height and said, oh, he must have been a really short guy. Well, 200 years ago, the average height was like 4 inches shorter. So he was actually average height. He wasn't a short guy. He wasn't a midget. He didn't have a Napoleon complex. But Napoleon was actually of all the stories you've heard about Napoleon, the one that is true is he's a remarkable general. And I don't, like I mentioned many times in this class, I don't do a lot of military history because I think it misses the bigger picture. But Napoleon's strategic brilliance is one of the things that will pull and rip France out of the French Revolution. If it's not for Napoleon, it's possible that France could have almost collapsed or separated into many different states. Napoleon is responsible for keeping France together and also ushering in a lot of really important big ideas. And we're going to see those as we go on here. So he was actually a general under the Directory. So the Directory, that conservative thing that we just talked about, sent him to go fight in Italy. Man, he won almost every battle that he had in Italy. And he thought that he was going to be sent back to France and sort of be glorious, but the Directory knew that he was this really powerful guy, and that people loved him back in France because he was winning all these battles. So they said, oh, Napoleon, you need to go fight in Egypt. You need to fight the enemies of France in Egypt. Well, the reason they did this was because they knew that if Napoleon was in France, because of how popular he was, that he'd be able to overthrow them. Well, what actually ends up happening is he's fighting in Egypt, and he keeps getting these reports of how awful things are going in France. They're like, oh, the enemies of France are on the gates, and there's civil war breaking out in France, and there's all these problems, and there's all this bad stuff the Directory is doing. We need you to come back and solve it. And so he talks to this guy, and this guy in power, and you don't need to remember his name, because I'm not going to ask you on a test, but a guy in power is like, Napoleon, come back and help me execute parts of the Directory, and then I'll take power, and then I'll make you my sort of second in command. Well, Napoleon says to the guy, yeah, that sounds great. But what he doesn't know, because I guess he didn't read a history book 200 years later, he doesn't know that Napoleon's a very ambitious guy. He doesn't really like being second fiddle. He doesn't really do well being second place. And so what happens is he does actually help his buddy stage the coup, but immediately after his buddy's like, yeah, thanks Napoleon, you're such an awesome guy, he just kills him. And that ends up putting Napoleon on the throne. This is the end of the Directory. He comes back to Europe. Everybody welcomes him as a war hero, and he quickly gains a horrendous amount of power, just a tremendous amount of power. And the reason for this is he's so popular. He's a war hero. He's kind of the way that we view a George Washington, right? You know, he won the American Revolution, became the first president. So same kind of thing with Napoleon. He creates the illusion of a republic. He calls himself the First Consul and says that they're going to be voting. He does actually a lot of good things. He does a lot of land reform. He lowers taxes. He raises the production of food. He's able to solve a lot of their food problems, and it makes him very popular very quickly. Well, quickly that disguise of a republic goes all out the window, and he claims himself emperor for life. And an emperor is even more high up on the hierarchy than a king was. So they start the French Revolution to get rid of their king, and then once they've got rid of their king, they go through a bunch of different things, and they end up with an emperor, which is even worse. But the key here is that the French people welcomed this. Many French people welcomed this because they were like, this is going to solve the violence that we've been having. This is going to solve all the problems that we've been having for so long. So even though they didn't like it, they viewed this as the best solution, at least in the short run. One of the ways, two of the things that are going to be very important here is Napoleon's going to end up losing Saint Domingue in this period. Saint Domingue was one of the few things that was keeping them in the black. This was one of the few things that were keeping them from going completely bankrupt. And remember, we talked about this last time, is that Saint Domingue has a slave revolt. And after the slave revolt, most of the money that they're making from the New World's all gone. And so how did they make that money back? Well, Napoleon's solution, and he was absolutely right in this decision, was to sell the land that he had taken from the Spanish, and that's going to be known as the Louisiana Purchase. He sells this land to the Americans for pennies on the dollar. He sells it for an incredibly low price. But what's really important about this is it funds Napoleon's reforms and also his military. And Napoleon is best associated with the military for those reasons, because what he's going to do is once he consolidates power in France, he's going to attack the people that he sees had been continually stabbing France in the back, not only in the French Revolution, but for centuries. Sort of the enemies of France who have been doing these terrible, terrible things for hundreds of years to France. And this is very popular in France because they have these new ideas of nationalism, this idea of French pride, and this idea that they want to bring that to other people and also to defeat their enemies. So we'll see that as we go forward. But his first solution, and sort of what he saw as his biggest threat, was Great Britain, because he realized that if he can take Great Britain out of the war, then there's no other naval power that can threaten them on the high seas, and that'll allow them to keep trading, that'll allow them to keep doing their shipping routes. And so what happens is he tries to invade Great Britain, and what would have happened had Napoleon landed in Great Britain is we would always be speaking French. There's no doubt about that. If the French army fought the British army, the French would win so hard at this point. And the reason for that is because the British don't need to have a big army, because they're an island. And so they are really proud of their navy. And so what happens is that this battle called the Battle of Trafalgar, basically what ends up happening is the French try to pull the British try to pull the French into the British Channel again. They end up fighting, and because of the heroism of this guy named Horatio Nelson, which you can see standing on the top of the center of London today, looking out towards the Battle of Trafalgar, the British actually are able to defeat the French at sea. It's one of the few times that Napoleon's actually going to be defeated in a fair fight. Well, what ends up happening is this is going to allow Britain to remain completely untouched during the Napoleonic Wars. That's going to be very important later on for what it's going to lead to. But what happens is that battle leads to Britain being not touched. Napoleon turns his attention to Europe, to mainland Europe, and he is incredibly successful. He basically, the first place he conquers is he conquers Spain because his half-brother was on the throne and he said that he was illegitimate, and so he conquers Spain. And then he starts to turn his attention east, and we're going to talk about this. But I want to talk about why he was successful. There's two main reasons. The first reason, well, actually three. The first reason is he's a strategic genius. Frankly, he's one of these people who sees battle in ways that other people don't. And I don't use the word genius. There's few people I think in history who are geniuses. I think people like Isaac Newton is a genius. I think a person like Genghis Khan is a genius, and I think Napoleon is a genius. He's on my short list of geniuses because he is so revolutionary in what he does. He has these new battle strategies. He has these new ways of organizing the military. Again, I'm not going to get into all of this. But the second reason he's effective, other than being a strategic genius, is he has the support of all of France. France loves this guy. He's won all of these battles. He's getting land. He's getting territory. He's improving the prestige of France. People love this guy. Additionally, he's not just improving the prestige on the battlefield. He's feeding them. He's able to solve the food problem in France, and this brings him a lot of support. And people are willing to fight for you if you can feed them. The other reason, and perhaps the most apparent reason, is his use of artillery, cannons, is revolutionized with Napoleon. And there's two ways that he revolutionizes it. The first way is he uses a new type of cannon that's a lot easier to transport. It's more mobile. You're able to deploy it faster. You don't have to have as many men to use it. But perhaps his biggest contribution is the sheer number of artillery that he started to use. Artillery used to be more of an afterthought, sort of a sort of a symbol while the infantry and the cavalry fought. It was sort of like you can think of it as the cherry on top of the sundae. For Napoleon, he realizes if I have a lot of these guys, I can kill a lot of people. So he has tons of artillery, way more than anybody else has. And when he fights people, well, they try to charge at him, but you're going to get blown up by his artillery. So what he does is he uses those three main things that we just talked about to push all the way into these territories. He gets horrendously wealthy, makes all this money, and he sees the sort of crown on top of his cap, the sort of the ultimate goal, is to conquer Russia. If he's able to conquer Russia, he can sweep back around and take all of Europe. He can completely unite Europe. He pushes into Russia in the June of 1813. It's important. Notice when he's doing this. He's doing this in the middle of the summer. The Russians know that he's doing this in the middle of the summer, but the Russians know even then that their best bet, their best way to actually beat Napoleon is not by fighting him, but rather letting him die in Russia. And that's exactly what they do. As as Napoleon brings his troops into Russia, what armies typically would do is they would sort of scavenge off the land. They would sort of build off what they've already done. They'd sort of eat the food, they'd sort of use the supplies of the people left behind. Well, as the Russians are retreating deeper and deeper into Russia, because remember, they're trying to pull him deep into Russia for the Russian winter to come in, they start to do what's called a scorched earth policy. They burn to the ground all of the fields, all of the cities, all of the towns. And Napoleon's troops, by the time they reach Moscow, the time they reach what's going to become St. Petersburg, they're completely they're completely ruined. They're in terrible shape. They're just not really doing well at all. And this slows the French push down. They get bogged down in Russia and they end up in awful winter in the winter in 1812. And what ends up happening is thousands of Napoleon's troops die. He ends up basically leaving Russia with less than 5% of the troops he entered with. That's going to be the real stop of Napoleon. He gets stopped by the Russian winter because the Russians pull him in, burn all the supplies in the middle of Russia so that he can't forage on them and survive, and then the Russian winter comes in and they're not ready for it because they're French. They don't live in Russia. They don't live in these terrible Arctic climates. And so what happens is they exile him. He comes back. They exile again. That part's not important. What's part that is important is that he brings a lot of stuff to Europe. It's not just, oh, he tried to conquer a lot of places and they lost all that territory. One of the biggest things that Napoleon is responsible for, and the French Revolution in general, is this growth of nationalism. This is a huge deal in the 18 and 1900s. This is the idea that you should be patriotic to your country. This is the idea of what it means to be a good Frenchman. And the real danger of nationalism is what it says about other countries. Inherent in the idea that I'm proud to be a Frenchman means I'm proud to be a Frenchman because I think it's better than being a German, or I think it's better than being a Spaniard, or I think it's better than being a British person. And what ends up happening is this nationalism provides another reason for people in Europe to fight against each other. It used to be about economics or about court politics or marriage ties. Now it's going to be because our people should rule Europe and your people should not. And that is a much more dangerous type of warfare. We're going to see that when we get to the World Wars and then later on. It also sparks modernization in countries in and outside of Europe. These ideas don't stay within France. They spread to Spain, they spread to Italy, they spread to Germany, they spread all over. And one of the things this is going to do is many people are going to frame their revolutions on the French Revolution. They're going to look to the French Revolution as a successful way to revolutionize your country. And this is also destruction of the old ways. You can kind of think of this as the birth of the modern era. The ancient regime is gone. Now you've got sort of modern politics. Now you've got voting. Now you've got sort of you've got political parties. Now you've kind of got new modernization. Now you've got new industrialism. All of these things make France a much more modern country, a much more powerful country, frankly. It's also going to be very influential for later political theorists. Marx and Engels pick this up big time. They are going to be responsible for the communist revolution, which we'll not talk about next time, but the time after that. So, that's our lecture on the French revolutions. I think I went over by about 15 minutes. Regardless, I hope this was easy and pretty straightforward for you, and I will hopefully see you guys on Wednesday. So, take care.